Welcome back to My Seminary Life. I'm your host, Brandon Knight, and welcome back to Fish Fridays, our Lenten season devotional series. Today we're going to be talking about being content. Because as I've been reflecting through A.W. Tozer's From the Grave, I've found that contentment is a big factor of not just Lent, but of the whole concept of fasting in general. You have to learn to be content. So let's talk about contentment today. As we journey through the wilderness of chosen suffering to know God, we are reminded that our strength does not lie within ourselves. When those hunger pains come, and whether they're physical, literal hunger pains or existential hunger pains, when those desires come for the thing that we have given up for Lent, when those feelings arrive, when those desires arrive, those are not reminders to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, to be strong in of ourselves. And it is not a reminder that, hey, there's grace, so, use it however you will. Instead, these are reminders that Jesus is our strength. Jesus in us. Just like in the words of the prayer breastplate of St. Patrick, that Christ in us, Christ is our strength when these hunger pains come. I had a listener reach out this past week to express thanks for this series I've been doing. This is this individual's very first time giving up something for Lent. And this person, I believe they said they gave up energy drinks. Good for them. Truly, truly good for them. Probably one of the things that I need to try to give up at some point is coffee. I am so scared I am going to go 40 plus days with a massive headache. That is the thing that keeps me back from fully giving up coffee at some point. But this person chose to give up energy drinks, and they've used these words, these devotions over the past couple of Fridays to see them through this time of chosen suffering. And the idea of giving up anything, but the idea of giving up energy drinks definitely plays into today's topic of being content. Because what is a fast but saying, I will be content with my situation? The Bible talks a lot about being content. Be content with such things as you have, or do not covet your neighbor's donkey. Like, we have these reminders in Scripture that we are to be thankful and content for what the Lord has blessed us with. Not to hoard resources, but to give generously. We'll come back to that. In Lent, in fasting, when we are saying no to something, we are saying yes to being content with what we do have. And I think sometimes when we talk about being content, when we think about being content, we have this idea that we're supposed to be happy. And I don't know if being happy and being content are necessarily supposed to go together. I think acceptance and content definitely go together. But I don't know if it's necessarily happiness and content, especially in those moments in your fast during Lent where those hunger pains do come up. To be content with the fact of, I am still not going to take my energy drink, stop by Dunkin', whatever the case may be. When we choose to still rely on Jesus to be our strength, to acknowledge the fact that Jesus is present in our situation, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be happy as we go along. Again, we come back to the imagery of Lent, a wilderness of chosen suffering. That is not inherently an enjoyable thing. To be content in a fast, to be content during Lent, is to accept one's situation as it is. Let's go back to what I've been fasting from. I talked about this a little bit in last week's episode, a specific example of being content. So I'm fasting from consumerism. And I talked about how in last week's episode, it is very tempting when I get off of work, I have to pass a McDonald's to get home. And I've talked about before how it's really easy for me before Lent to justify swinging by and getting a nice big old Coke, or picking up dinner. It's just going to be leftovers anyway. I will just grab myself a number 7. That's my favorite meal. And instead, in the context of last week's episode, I've been using the words of the prayer breastplate of St. Patrick to remind me where my strength lies. But at the same time, my strength does not rely on myself. It is of Jesus. And me saying no to stopping at McDonald's and participating in consumerism, I am saying yes to being content with what we have in the house. Would I rather have 2 cheeseburgers, a large fry, and a giant drum of Coke? Yes. That sounds delicious right now. But I will be content. I am practicing being content by coming home and reheating leftovers or enjoying some hamburger helper. It is actually not too bad. Gluten-free hamburger helper actually isn't too bad. But being content during a fast, being content during Lent, goes beyond, I think, just being content with your situation of saying no to whatever it is that you've given up and yes to your situation. I think this goes beyond that. I think it also shows being content in Jesus, especially when we go through this with the proper approach. When we go through a fast, when we go through Lent, drawing upon the strength of Jesus, who is our strength, a very present strength for us, the present strength for us. And to go through this time period of chosen suffering to know God, when we hold to our fast and we do not give in to our hunger pains, we are acknowledging our contentment, not just in our circumstances, but in what God has given to us. We see our resources. As I've been fasting from consumerism, I've been speaking a lot to myself in terms of resources. You know, the food we have in the house, the money we have, the everything, the time that I have. When we look at the resources that the Lord has given us, we can be content in Him by acknowledging our thankfulness for those resources He has given us. And above all, just being content for what He has done for us and who He is. Acknowledging our contentment in our situation acknowledges our contentment. There's a tiger. There's a tiger in my house as I'm trying to make a good point. Hello, Tiger Cooper. Acknowledging our contentment in our situations acknowledges our contentment in God, the giver of all good things. But there's another form of contentment that Tozer talks about, that a specific form of being content that he talks about, that at the writing of the book he claims was a big issue in the church. I don't know if it so much is now, but you're allowed to disagree with me on this. A contentment for spiritual growth. Apparently it was common when Tozer was a pastor to find people who believed they didn't have to grow anymore as a Christian once they put their faith in Jesus. They had the fullness of Jesus in their belief, and so there was no place to go. There was no growth to be done, or as it is more sometimes also called, sanctification. There was no sanctification to be taken place. I find that interesting. I don't know if that is so much an issue now. Maybe it looks differently. But to me, in my experience, it isn't so much that people are, they have their come to Jesus moment and they don't see any need or desire to grow, to be sanctified. It's the bigger issue seems to be that everyone seems to act like they are the most enlightened, most spiritual Christian. That seems the issue we seem to have is an issue of pride more so than an issue of not seeing the value of growing. This is, in a sense, a negative form of being content. I am happy with my spiritual growth. There is nowhere else to go. A proper fast through Lent actually achieves both forms of content. It acknowledges our contentment for our situation, for God, while also not being content with our current spiritual growth. This being in a fast, being in Lent puts us in situations where we have to rely on the Lord. Lent forces us, fasting forces us to turn to Jesus, to acknowledge Jesus as our strength, to acknowledge God as the giver of all good things, to be content for what we have. All these things stretches and grows us as individuals. Again, going back to Tozer's example of what Lent is, it's this season of uprooting the weeds that have grown in the heart, right? These are the tools to do that uprooting. It isn't so much the fasting in of itself that is the means to get us to the field to root out the weeds. It is being content. It is finding our strength in Jesus. It is acknowledging our contentment in God. These are the individual tools that clear out the weeds from the wilderness of our hearts. A long time ago, here on the show, I did a episode defining what I thought sanctification is. You can hear producer Cooper singing the Paw Patrol theme song, can't you? I did an episode a long time ago during the first series on spiritual formation on how I would define sanctification. And I've been thinking a lot about that definition and about that episode. And I think it might be good if we came back to this topic of sanctification at some point on its own. Maybe not necessarily a part of Fish Fridays, but to revisit this because I did have a very technical definition of a very academic definition of sanctification, and there's a lot of that definition that I think still holds true, but I think there is something that I would change about this definition. So given where my thoughts and my reflection has been during this series, I think there's some things I would change, but that's going to be an episode for another day. So as we continue through the wilderness of chosen suffering to know God, be content. Be content. Be satisfied what you have. And that can sound very like unpassionate, very uncaring. Be happy with what you have. No, I did not say to be happy. I said to be content. That is hard. That is not to, I think being content, telling someone to be content versus them to be happy doesn't minimize the person's hunger as they go through their fast. To be content, I think, acknowledges the difficulty. To tell them to be happy, on the other hand, I think that glosses over the real hunger pains that someone could be experiencing. Be content. Find your contentment in what you do have, what the Lord has given to you, has blessed you with. If anything, His very presence. Find your contentment in those things. Acknowledge your contentment for those things. Be thankful. Express praise to God. And as you move through this season, finding contentment in what you do have, you will be fighting against this very thing that Tozer warned against, of being too content for your own situation, for your own spiritual growth. There's more to be said on spiritual growth, but as we move through Lent turning to the Lord, to know God in our chosen suffering, we find that we will not be content with our own spiritual growth. To be content with your situation is to say that you are not content with where you're at spiritually and that you want to grow. And growth comes from knowing God. Thank you for listening to today's episode. A little bit shorter, but that's okay. That's actually what I was hoping these episodes would be. The last two have gone the usual length of an episode. Today we're coming in a little bit short, and that's good. That's what I was actually hoping for. If you haven't yet already, please consider rating and reviewing this show wherever you get your podcasts. Pass this episode along to a friend, and follow the show on YouTube, our YouTube channel, Studio 219, the place for faith and pop culture, if you want some more of that in your life. You can also check out the other great shows here on the Anazao Ministries Podcast Network, from Whole Church to Systematic Geekology to my sister podcast, Kung Fu Pizza Party. But that's all for now. We'll see you next time. This has been My Seminary Life. I've been your host, Brandon Knight, and I'm reminding you, as always, that theology is best served with a side of coleslaw.